Every personality trait you are proud of was born from a wound. The confidence you perform in rooms full of people, the independence you wear like armor, the emotional detachment you have learned to call strength. None of it was chosen. All of it was constructed. In direct response to pain you were never taught how to process. This is not an accusation. It is a diagnosis. The human personality does not develop in a vacuum. It develops in response to environment, in response to threat, in response to the moments, and there were many, when being yourself produced consequences you could not afford. So you adapted, you modified, you became whoever you needed to be to survive the specific conditions of your specific childhood. And then you spent the rest of your life calling that survival strategy your personality. You are not who you think you are. You are who fear made you. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the human psyche. What he found was not flattering. He found that most of what men call their personality is not authentic self-expression. It is defensive self-construction. Layer upon layer of psychological armor built to protect a wound that was never allowed to heal. The persona, that carefully maintained social face, is not the real man. It is the shield the real man hides behind. And here is the cold truth about shields. They do not just protect you from danger. They protect you from everything, including connection, including truth, including the possibility of ever being genuinely known by another human being or by yourself. Think about the traits you consider most essentially yours. Perhaps you pride yourself on never needing anyone. That independence was not born from strength. It was born from the moment, and you know the moment, when needing someone produced pain severe enough that you decided, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that needing was dangerous. So you buried the need, and you called the burial independence. Perhaps you pride yourself on always being in control. That control was not born from discipline. It was born from a childhood environment where things were unpredictable enough, chaotic enough, threatening enough. That control became the only tool available for managing the terror. So you gripped it, and you never let go, and you called the grip your personality. Perhaps you pride yourself on not caring what people think. That indifference was not born from confidence. It was born from repeated experiences of having your genuine self, your real opinions, your real feelings, your real desires, met with dismissal, ridicule, or punishment, severe enough to make visibility feel like a threat. So you withdrew. You built the wall, and you called the wall freedom. Schopenhauer saw this with a clarity that most men find unbearable. He understood that the will-driving human behavior is largely unconscious, that men believe they are acting from reason and choice, when they are almost entirely acting from drives they have never examined and wounds they have never named. The man who believes he has built himself through deliberate character development has almost certainly built himself through unconscious fear response. And he cannot tell the difference because he has never stopped to look. Nietzsche had a word for this. He called it resentment. The psychology of the wounded man who converts his wound into a virtue, who takes the thing that was done to him, the deprivation, the rejection, the fear, and reframes it as a chosen value. The man who was never shown affection as a child and now calls himself emotionally self-sufficient. The man who was punished for expressing anger and now calls himself calm. The man who was humiliated for vulnerability and now calls himself strong. The conversion is seamless, the self-deception is total, and the tragedy is complete. Because the man built entirely from fear, responses cannot access what he actually is. The fear built a structure so comprehensive, so intricate, so convincing, that the man inside it has forgotten there was ever anything else. He mistakes the cage for his character. He mistakes the wound for his identity. And he defends both with a ferocity that should tell him everything, but tells him nothing. Consider the moments when your constructed personality is most fierce in its defense. The moments when someone questions your independence and you feel something close to rage. The moments when someone gets close enough to see something you did not intend to show, and you immediately withdraw. The moments when the armor is threatened and the response is disproportionate, intense, almost animal. That intensity is not strength. That is a wound being touched. The Stoics understood something that most modern men have completely inverted. Marcus Aurelius wrote consistently about the necessity of examining one's own character, not to celebrate it, but to interrogate it. To ask not who am I presenting myself to be, but what is actually driving this behavior? What is the real motive beneath the rationalization? What is the wound beneath the virtue? The Stoic practice of self-examination is not comfortable. It is not designed to be. It is designed to produce clarity. And the first thing that clarity reveals is almost always confronting. That most of what you call your character is not character at all. It is coping mechanism. It is adaptation. It is the psychological equivalent of scar tissue that formed over a wound that never healed properly. Scar tissue is not the same as skin. It is harder, less flexible, less sensitive. It protects, but it also cannot feel in the way that undamaged tissue can feel. And most men are so covered in psychological scar tissue that they have lost the capacity to feel much of anything at all. And they call this maturity. The most dangerous thing about fear-built personalities is their internal coherence. They make sense. They hold together. They have a logic. The man who was abandoned builds an identity around self-sufficiency, and it is internally consistent. Every decision he makes flows from that central wound. He can explain himself perfectly within the framework of what he has built. He just cannot see that the framework itself was constructed by a frightened child, making the only adaptations available to him. And because the framework is internally coherent, because it holds together, because it makes sense from the inside, the man inside it has no reason to question it. It feels like truth. It feels like reality. It feels like this is simply who he is. The possibility that it was built rather than discovered never occurs to him, because built things feel exactly like real things when you have been living inside them long enough. This is the most sophisticated trap the psyche can construct, a prison with no visible bars, a cage that feels like home, an identity that feels like truth, but was assembled from the wreckage of experiences the child had no tools to process. You were a child once, and that child was faced with experiences, some dramatic, some mundane, some so ordinary that you have never even classified them as formative, that required adaptation. You adapted. That was not weakness, that was survival. The child had no other tools. But you are not a child anymore, and yet the child's adaptations are still running your life. The child's fear responses are still shaping your choices. the child's wounds are still determining what you will allow yourself to want, to need, to feel, to pursue. The child built the cage, and the man has been living inside it, and calling it his personality. Machiavelli wrote that the greatest mistake a man can make is to believe he is acting freely when he is actually being controlled. He was writing about political power, but the principle applies with devastating precision to the psychology of the self-deceived man. The man who believes he is living according to his authentic values, when he is actually living according to the fear responses of a child who had no other choice. The difference between those two men is everything. The man living from fear is predictable. He can be manipulated through his wounds. He can be controlled through his blind spots. He will repeat the same patterns indefinitely, in relationships, in work, in self-conception, because the patterns are not really his. They are the child's, and the child's patterns were never designed for the man's life. Look at your relationships, not the surface of them, the structure of them, the recurring dynamics, the patterns that appear regardless of who the other person is, the ways in which different relationships with different people produce the same fundamental experience. That repetition is not coincidence. That repetition is the child's fear responses, creating the same conditions over and over, because those conditions are familiar, and familiar feels safe, even when familiar feels like suffering. Look at the way you respond to success, the self-sabotage that appears at precisely the moment things begin to go well, the unconscious movement away from exactly what you claimed to want. This is not random. This is the fear-built personality maintaining the conditions it was designed for. The child was conditioned in scarcity, in limitation, in the specific emotional environment of not enough. And the man who grew from that child has a nervous system that recognizes not enough as home. What does it take to begin dismantling this? It begins with a willingness to look at your most defended traits with genuine suspicion, not with self-contempt. Suspicion, the cold, clinical curiosity of a man who wants to know the truth more than he wants to maintain the comfortable fiction. What is this trait actually protecting? What happens? What do you feel when this part of the construction is threatened? What would it mean if this thing you have called strength was actually fear wearing strength's clothing? These questions are not comfortable. They are not meant to be. Jung called the work of examining the shadow, the parts of the psyche that were buried rather than integrated, the most demanding work a human being can undertake. Not because the shadow is always dark, but because what lives in the shadow is often everything that was rejected, suppressed, or buried in service of the persona's construction. And what lives in the shadow is often more real, more alive, more authentically you than anything that survived the fear-building process. The need that was buried because needing was dangerous, that lives in the shadow. The anger that was suppressed because anger produced punishment, that lives in the shadow. The sensitivity that was mocked into hiding, that lives in the shadow. The desire that was deemed unacceptable, that lives in the shadow. All of it is still there. All of it is still alive. All of it is still influencing every decision you make, from a place you cannot see. The personality you were given by fear is not useless. It served a purpose. It brought you here. It kept you functioning when functioning was difficult. It deserves acknowledgement, not contempt. But it is not who you are. Beneath the construction, beneath the independence that was actually isolation, beneath the control that was actually terror, beneath the emotional detachment that was actually the only way to survive what was happening, there is something that was never touched by the fear, something that existed before the adaptations began, something that has been waiting, with the patience that only the buried and the suppressed possess. Most men will never find it. They will live and die inside the personality fear built for them. They will defend it fiercely. They will mistake it for authenticity. They will pass the fear responses on to the people closest to them without ever understanding what they are transmitting. Their children will inherit the adaptations. The cycle will continue. The cage will be rebuilt in the next generation, with different walls, but the same architecture. You do not have to be that man, but wanting to be different is not enough. Knowing is not enough. The gap between knowing and becoming is crossed only through the kind of sustained, unflinching self-examination that most men cannot tolerate for more than 5 minutes. It requires returning to the examination daily. It requires sitting with what you find without immediately explaining it away. It requires the willingness to be profoundly, fundamentally wrong about yourself, and to stay with that wrongness long enough to understand what it is telling you. It produces a man who knows exactly who he is, not because he was told, not because fear assembled him, not because survival required it, but because he looked directly, without flinching, at everything he had been and everything he had buried, and chose, for the first time with genuine freedom, what to keep and what to finally lay down. Your personality was built by fear. The man you could actually be has been waiting in the dark ever since.